It was an era defined by fear, by a thirst for power that knew no bounds. The year was 1792, and the streets of Paris pulsed with the chaos of revolution. Here, amidst the blood-soaked cobblestones, a horrific spectacle was unfolding, one so savage that even the history books struggled to contain it. A woman, a noble, was about to experience the darkest chapter in a story that had already been written in blood. This is the tragic tale of Princess de Lamballe, a woman whose fate would be sealed by the wrath of the French Revolution. Her story, though one of royalty and privilege, ends in a moment of pure brutality, a symbol of the destruction of everything the old regime stood for. But what happened to her? How did a life that glittered with promises of grandeur fall so violently into the hands of those who sought only vengeance? Before we dive into the brutal history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because when you walk this path of forgotten horrors, it's important to never forget, lest we repeat it. Before the bloodshed reached its peak, there were whispers. Whispers of dissatisfaction. Whispers of revolt. The revolution did not come out of nowhere. It was born from years of simmering anger and suffering. This chapter explores the state of the French aristocracy just before the storm broke. A fragile world teetering on the edge of collapse. As the guillotine came into existence, so too did the unimaginable fear that came with it. For the princess, it was not just a time of uncertainty. It was the end of her world. A world in which she had been nothing less than royalty, untouchable, or so she thought. The day the revolutionaries came to her doorstep, everything changed. In this moment, the castle walls, so strong and so proud, seemed to collapse under the weight of a single truth. No one was safe. In this video, we turn to the final moments of Princess de Lamballe's life. A figure who had once danced in the most opulent salons of Versailles now finds herself face to face with a mob who would show her no mercy. But it was not just death that awaited her. It was a ritual of terror, an execution that would send shockwaves through the very heart of the monarchy. The French mob did something to Princess de Lamballe's body so graphic that even the revolutionaries would shy away from its gruesome details. But it is in these horrors that we find the truth of what happens when a society loses its moral compass and lets its anger consume it. Her death, her body, would be a symbol, a warning. But to whom? In the years leading up to the French Revolution, the streets of Paris were alive with the whispers of something dark, something inevitable. The very air seemed to crackle with the tension of a society on the brink of tearing itself apart. At the heart of this storm stood a glittering, opulent world, the world of the French nobility. But for all its elegance, for all its power, it was a world built on fragility, sustained by a delicate balance of wealth, status, and an illusion of invulnerability. And within this bubble of luxury, the Princess de Lamballe lived, her days spent in the golden courts of Versailles, her nights in the embrace of extravagance and privilege. Born into royalty, Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, Princess de Lamballe, had every advantage the world could offer her. She had the title, the wealth, the beauty. She was, by all measures, untouchable. At Versailles, she was a close confidant of Queen Marie Antoinette, a woman who herself embodied the grandeur and excesses of the French monarchy. The two women were inseparable, bound by their shared status as outsiders within the court. The princess was a woman who had everything, except the one thing that could have saved her in the days to come: the ability to see the storm that was gathering on the horizon. As the years passed, the cracks in the aristocracy began to widen. Beneath the glittering facade, the suffering of the common people was growing. France, once the beacon of European wealth and power, was crumbling under the weight of its excesses. The monarchy was bankrupt, the people were starving, and the whispers of rebellion were growing louder with each passing day. The very luxuries that had once defined the nobility were now seen as symbols of decadence, as the masses watched their leaders revel in riches while they endured unimaginable hardships. In the heart of Paris, the unrest began to boil over. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 was only the beginning. From there, the revolution would sweep through France like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. It wasn't just the monarchy that was at risk. It was an entire way of life, a system that had been in place for centuries. The revolutionaries were not just fighting for freedom. They were fighting for vengeance. They were fighting to dismantle a world that had oppressed them for so long. And yet, within the walls of Versailles, life continued as if nothing had changed. The nobles danced, they partied, they lived as if the revolution were a distant threat, something that could never touch them. But Princess de Lamballe was blind to the danger closing in. She continued to live her life in the lavish salons and courts of the aristocracy, surrounded by opulence, completely unaware that the foundations of her world were beginning to crumble. The revolution was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. By the time the storm finally reached her, it was already too late. The mob did not come gently. There was no polite knock on the door of the palace, no offer of refuge, no time for a last-minute escape. It came like a wave crashing against the fragile cliffs of her world, sweeping away everything in its path. The royal family, including Princess de Lamballe, were thrown into the tumult of the revolution. The once pristine halls of Versailles now echoed with cries of rage, and the royal family's once unquestionable authority was shattered beyond repair. The princess, along with the rest of the aristocracy, was no longer safe in her ivory tower. At first, she tried to flee, like many of her peers. But where could she go? The revolutionaries had already taken hold of the country, and no place was safe. The princess's fate was sealed as surely as the fate of the monarchy itself. She was caught, dragged from her life of luxury and thrown into the streets of Paris, a place that no longer held any place for her kind. And so, Princess de Lamballe, once a symbol of aristocratic elegance and power, became a prisoner of a new world that would show her no mercy. The revolution had no respect for her title, her beauty, or her former life. It only saw her as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with France. But there was one thing the revolutionaries did not anticipate. The brutality they would show to Princess de Lamballe would be a signal to the rest of the aristocracy. A signal that no one, no matter how high they had once risen, was safe. The French mob would make an example of her. And in doing so, they would show the world just how far their revolution would go.
The echoes of her capture and subsequent death would resonate for years to come. Her story would serve as a warning to anyone who thought themselves safe from the coming tide of violence. The fall of Princess de Lamballe was not just a personal tragedy, it was the death knell of an entire way of life. As the flames of revolution raged across France, the fate of those who once lived in palaces was sealed in the streets. The French mob, driven by a hatred so deep it was almost primal, sought to tear down the very remnants of the old regime, everything that had once represented privilege, power, and an unapproachable nobility. And in the midst of this fury stood Princess de Lamballe. Her name, once whispered in the grandest of salons, now shouted in the streets by those who saw her as the very embodiment of everything that had to be destroyed. It was on that fateful day in September 1792, as the storm of revolution continued to batter the heart of the French monarchy, that the princess's life would come to an end. Captured by the mob, she was dragged through the streets of Paris, her once elegant demeanor now a stark contrast to the brutality of her surroundings. The sounds of her footsteps echoed through the alleys, mingling with the chants of rage and the howls of the crowd. A woman who had once danced in glittering ballrooms was now a pawn in a cruel, bloodthirsty game, a game where no one was spared. The mob that tore through Paris had no use for mercy. They did not care for titles, for beauty, for grace. The revolution had turned its gaze on all who were deemed enemies of the people, and the princess was no exception. She was bound, her fate sealed by the very people she had once looked down upon. Her former status meant nothing now. She was merely another victim of the terror that had overtaken the city. And as she was dragged toward her execution, she could surely hear the deafening chants that reverberated around her. Death to the aristocrats! Death to the monarchy! There was no dignity in her capture, no dignity in her suffering, but the brutality that awaited her was beyond even the mob's usual ferocity. For what happened to Princess de Lamballe in those final moments is so horrific, so violent, that it stands as a symbol of the revolution's darkest impulses. The mob's hatred was not satisfied by mere death. It demanded humiliation, desecration, a complete erasure of everything the princess had once represented. And in the midst of this fury stood Princess de Lamballe. Her name, once whispered in the grandest of salons, now shouted in the streets by those who saw her as the very embodiment of everything that had to be destroyed. It was on that fateful day in September 1792, as the storm of revolution continued to batter the heart of the French monarchy, that the princess's life would come to an end. Captured by the mob, she was dragged through the streets of Paris, her once elegant demeanor now a stark contrast to the brutality of her surroundings. The sounds of her footsteps echoed through the alleys, mingling with the chants of rage and the howls of the crowd. A woman who had once danced in glittering ballrooms was now a pawn in a cruel, bloodthirsty game, a game where no one was spared. The mob that tore through Paris had no use for mercy. They did not care for titles, for beauty, for grace. The revolution had turned its gaze on all who were deemed enemies of the people, and the princess was no exception. She was bound, her fate sealed by the very people she had once looked down upon. Her former status meant nothing now. She was merely another victim of the terror that had overtaken the city. And as she was dragged toward her execution, she could surely hear the deafening chants that reverberated around her. Death to the aristocrats! Death to the monarchy! There was no dignity in her capture, no dignity in her suffering, but the brutality that awaited her was beyond even the mob's usual ferocity. For what happened to Princess de Lamballe in those final moments is so horrific, so violent, that it stands as a symbol of the revolution's darkest impulses. The mob's hatred was not satisfied by mere death. It demanded humiliation, desecration, a complete erasure of everything the princess had once represented. When they finally reached the site of her execution, the horror was only just beginning. The mob was not content with her execution alone. Legend has it that after she was murdered, her body was desecrated in a manner so grotesque that it sent waves of shock through even the most hardened revolutionaries. Her head, severed from her body, was paraded around the streets, a grisly trophy for those who had once suffered under the aristocracy's rule. But it did not end there. The mob went further still. Some accounts tell of the gruesome mutilation of her corpse, a final act of violence that spoke volumes about the depth of anger and hatred that the revolution had brought to the surface. The brutality of her death was a message to the rest of the aristocracy. The old world was gone. No one, no matter their rank, their beauty, or their ties to royalty, was safe from the wrath of the revolution. Princess de Lamballe, who had once been seen as an untouchable symbol of elegance, was now reduced to nothing more than a lifeless body, her name forever etched into the bloody history of the French Revolution. As the princess's body was desecrated, the streets of Paris rang with the triumphant cries of the mob. But for those who had known the princess, for those who had witnessed the rise and fall of her world, her death marked something far darker. It was not just the loss of a single life, it was the destruction of an entire way of being, a way of life that had once held power over the masses. In her death, the revolution had not only dismantled the monarchy, it had torn apart everything that had once given meaning to the aristocracy.
Her legacy, if it can be called that, became a grim symbol of the costs of revolution. To the revolutionaries, she was a martyr, a casualty of a larger war against a system they had come to see as corrupt and unjust. To the aristocrats, she was a victim, a symbol of everything they had lost, a woman who had once been sacrificed at the altar of change. And to the common people, she was both a warning and a symbol of their newfound power, an icon of what could happen to those who had long held dominion over them. But what of the true nature of her death? What does it say about the revolution that such brutality was meted out to a woman who, though born into privilege, had never been a direct player in the power struggles that led to the revolution? Was it vengeance? Was it justice? Or was it something darker? A manifestation of the revolution's own loss of humanity in its quest to overthrow the old world. As her body was discarded, torn apart, and forgotten in the streets, one thing was certain: the death of Princess de Lamballe marked the end of an era. It was the end of the monarchy, yes, but it was also the end of a world where power could be held in the hands of the few, where privilege could insulate you from the suffering of the masses. The revolution had torn that world apart, leaving behind only the ruin of what had once been. And in that ruin, the name of Princess de Lamballe would live on, etched not in stone and not in history's most revered chapters, but in the darkness of a memory too brutal to forget. The death of Princess de Lamballe remains one of the most haunting symbols of the French Revolution's brutality, a moment when the veneer of nobility was torn away, revealing the raw, unrelenting violence that swept through France. Her life, once defined by luxury, her final moments by horror, tells a story not just of one woman's tragic end, but of the wider, catastrophic collapse of a centuries-old system. In her story, we see the fragility of power, the way those who once seemed untouchable can fall, not merely by death, but by the complete erasure of everything that once gave them meaning. The revolution, in its quest for justice, found its reflection in the blood-soaked streets of Paris. What began as a movement for equality soon spiraled into a force of destruction where no one, noble or common, was spared from its savage hand. But while Princess de Lamballe's death was in some ways a consequence of her status, it was also the product of a deeper, more tragic reality, a society driven to the edge by hunger, inequality, and a thirst for revenge. Her fate was not a solitary tragedy, but a part of a larger, brutal cleansing, a reminder of the unyielding tide of history that sweeps away both the guilty and the innocent alike. As the echoes of her death faded into the annals of history, they left behind a legacy, not of grandeur, not of nobility, but of suffering, violence, and the ultimate question: what happens when we allow hatred to consume us? The fall of Princess de Lamballe, once an icon of privilege, has since become a symbol of the price of revolution, a symbol of the toll that justice, when distorted, can extract from both the rulers and the ruled. In the end, her story stands as a testament to the brutal costs of change, a reminder that while the old must die for the new to emerge, the blood spilled in that process can never truly be washed away.